I will read you the words of Professor Barendt about his presentation on academic freedom in England. So Professor Barendt opened this paper explaining that this paper outlines the current position of academic freedom in England. Since 1998, education, including higher education, has been a devolved matter for which the Scottish Parliament and government are responsible. So recent reforms enacted in Westminster do not apply to Scotland, so we are only talking about England. The first part outlines the relevant legal provisions in force now and indicates their difficulties. Secondly, there is some discussion of recent controversies which reveal perhaps a fragile protection afforded academics in practice. In the third section of the paper, Professor Barendt discussed the recent proposals and the government bill at a present proceeding through Parliament, which might strengthen the protection of academic freedom. So first part, the legal position. Academic freedom has been recognized in English law since the Education Reform Act of 1988. Section 202, paragraph 2 of the Act was added to the legislation against the wishes of the government to protect the position of academic staff. They lost tenure, in effect permanent employment under other provision of that legislation, which enabled universities to make them redundant to save money. For discussion on this specific point, Professor Barendt directly referred to his book, already mentioned by Professor Bull, Academic Freedom and the Law. Authorities should ensure that academic staff have freedom within the law to question and test received wisdom and to put forward new ideas and controversial or unpopular opinions without placing themselves in jeopardy of losing their jobs or privileges they may have at their institutions. This has remained a legal definition of individual academic freedom, and it has been incorporated in university statutes and other legal instruments regulating British universities. It protects only academic staff and not, as in Germany, research students. Taken literally, the language will appear to protect the general freedom of academic staff to express their views on any political and social question, as well as freedom of research and teaching. Though in Barendt's view, Professor Barendt's view, it is better to treat this general freedom as an aspect of freedom of speech which is enjoyed by everyone, rather than privilege of academic staff. Until recently, institutional academic freedom has not been legally protected, though it was recognized in practice partially for the older universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Durham, London, and the civic universities established in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as well as for Scottish universities. Moreover, courts are unwilling to entertain legal challenges, either by individual academics or by students, to decisions by universities, as judges are reluctant to question the exercise of academic judgment. Though there has been de facto institutional freedom or autonomy, even though it was not recognized in law. Now, however, university autonomy is to some extent guaranteed and defined by the Higher Education and Research Act of 2017. The most important recent legislation regulating English universities, Section 2, sets out the general duties of the Office for Students, OFS, the public body established by the Act to regulate universities and other providers of higher education. The OFS must have regard to the need to protect the institutional autonomy of these institutions and institutional autonomy is defined as management freedom, and the freedom to determine the content of courses and how they are taught. It also includes the individual freedom within the law of academic staff as formulated in the 1998 legislation and university statutes. There is no obvious explanation for the incorporation of the individual freedom of academic staff as an aspect of the institutional autonomy of higher education institutions. It seems to Professor Barendt a recipe for conflict between the claims of institutions and their academic staff. And once again, he referred to his book, Academic Freedom and the Law, for further discussions. The 2017 legislations appears to consider the institutional claim Parliament as the individual freedom is treated as merely an aspect of it. It might be right, but in some circumstances, the individual claim should prevail. Where, for example, a university decided to discipline an academic merely because it dislikes the style of teaching or their unorthodox views. This is not just a theoretical point, as the following section of this paper shows there may be real conflicts between universities and their staffs. So, here is the second part of the presentation, Academic Freedom in Practice, Recent Controversies. The general working climate in English universities has changed considerably in the last 25-30 years, with a decline in academic independence and freedom. There has been a massive increase in the student population and in the number of universities and other institutions providing higher education. They compete to attract students who may be required to pay fees of just over 9,000 a year. Indeed, the OFS is required to have regard to the need to encourage competition between higher education providers when exercising its function. And Professor Barendt refers on this point to Higher Education and Research Act of 2017. This meant that unpopular courses may be closed simply because they do not attract enough students, and that's a point we discussed this morning with the first panel. Whatever their academic merits, and their teachers may be dismissed or redeployed to teach those courses likely to attract more students. These developments have a number of consequences and implications for academic freedom. First, there has been an increase in what may be termed management culture, both at the departmental level and in universities as a whole. Academic teaching is directed by heads of departments to ensure consistency of provision, while academics are required to submit 4 pieces of writing every few years as a part of the assessments of each university's research outputs, now known as the Research Excellence Framework. Consequently, the quality of each academic's teaching and research is regularly assessed both within the university and outside by the panel of academic experts who rate how each university department is doing. This may to some extent be desirable, but it certainly leads to a loss of the independence of academics to determine exactly how they teach and how often they publish their research. Universities must now be much more responsive than they used to be to their students. Like those of consumers, students' preferences must be satisfied, for otherwise they may move to other universities, and the latter may lose the fees on which they are more and more dependent. Many students are now reluctant to be challenged by new ideas and arguments, which they find upsetting or shocking to their political or religious sensibilities. Hence, they may demand warnings in the course material contains matter which they may find offensive, the so-called trigger warnings. The the complaints of students reinforced by social media campaigns have led to a number of recent incidents with disturbing repercussion for academic freedom in England. Perhaps the best known case concerned Kathleen Stock, a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex, who resigned after a student campaign which had cancelled for her dismissal for expressing gender-critical views. On several occasions, including giving evidence to a parliamentary committee, she argued that allowing the self-certification of a change of gender would endanger women in refuges and safe centres who might be threatened by transgender women still physically male. The campaign was strident and was supported by the local branch of the university and college union, the organisation which represents the interest of university teachers. Professor Stock clearly found the pressure on campus intolerable, though she was supported by an open letter signed by 200 academic philosophers defending her academic freedom. There have been at least 2 episodes at the University of Bristol, an old and well-established civic university. In one, Professor David Miller was dismissed from his sociology chair following complaints from the university Jewish Society about one element in a course of lectures, and frequent posts on his blog which attacked the society as being a part of a coordinated Zionist campaign directed by the State of Israel. A legal inquiry commissioned by the university found that Miller's post did not amount to the offence of hate speech. Nevertheless, he was dismissed in October 2021 for not meeting the standards Bristol University expected from its staff. His appeal was dismissed a few months later. On the other hand, law professor Stephen Greer was cleared in July 2021 after complaints by the Bristol Islamic Society that he has shown Islamophobia in his human rights lectures, in particular that covering human rights, Islam, China, and the Far East. The association conducted a vicious social media campaign. Its call for Professor Greer's dismissal was supported by an online petition with 4,000 signatures. At one point, Professor Greer, a distinguished comparative human rights scholar, even feared he was vulnerable to physical attack. Although he was exonerated by the university official examining the complaints, a decision upheld on appeal, Stephen Greer did not feel he was well supported by the university or by the law department, which decided against him, against his wishes, that the course will drop the element dealing with Islam and China in the context of human rights in order to meet the sensitivities of the offended students. Professor Greer has written a full account of this unhappy episode in a book called Falsely Accused of Islamophobia, My Struggle Against Academic Cancellation. The book also discusses other recent cases where academic freedom has been imperiled by student campaigns and often a supine university reluctant to question student complaints. Whatever the merits of these partial cases, there can be no doubt that academic freedom may now be seriously threatened by student complaints, backed up by protesting campuses or social media campaigns which may attract support from people entirely outside the university. Bristol University's decision to delete from Professor Greer's human rights course the module or element dealing with Islam and human rights was a clear infringement of a university teacher's academic freedom to determine what topics are covered. Through, of course, it could argue that the freedom to determine the content of this course and how they are taught is part of its institutional autonomy. there is here a conflict between individual academic freedom and university autonomy. So we're now opening the third part, strengthening the protection of academic freedom. The government became concerned 2 or 3 years ago as an inadequate protection afforded academic freedom provided by universities. A paper by an influential think tank or policy group, Policy Exchange, influenced its thinking. And the title of the paper is Academic Freedom in the UK, Protecting Viewpoint Diversity. And it found that academics frequently self-censored their expressions of views, particularly if they were on the right politically. There was evidence of some support of discrimination against conservative academics when considering applications for promotion within a university of all research grants and other support. The government had therefore introduced a bill, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Bill, which might strengthen the protection of academic freedom. As the title of the bill indicates, its main concern is to give greater protection to freedom of speech on campus, not only for academic staff, but for students and for visiting speakers whose invitation to speak at a society meeting may be cancelled as a result of a student campaigns and pressure. Academic freedom is a relatively minor object of the measure. Among its provisions is a requirement for the Office for Students to appoint a director of free speech and academic freedom as a member of its board. The 2017 Act will be amended to add the need to protect academic freedom as one of the general functions of the Office for Students. We might be required by the Secretary of State for Education to report on matters relating to academic freedom and freedom of speech on university campuses. Another provision extends the protection of academic freedom by requiring the providers of higher education to take steps to ensure that applicants for jobs at their institution are not adversely affected by their previous exercise of the freedom. The bill has been controversial, largely because some universities consider it unnecessary and likely to lead to the imposition on them of further reporting conditions by the OFS. But the episodes discussed earlier in this paper show it will be very wrong to ignore the threats posed to exercise of academic freedom by students and social media campaigns, unfortunately aided by university administrators anxious to placate student consumers of higher education. For too long, lip service has been paid to a freedom which is vital for the acquisition of knowledge in all areas of scholarship and learning and for the development of open and inquiring minds. Thank you for your listening.